Did the man who stood closest to Abraham Lincoln die because he refused to leave the president's side? And if that is true, why do so few people know his name while the president he served became one of the most remembered men in history? If stories like this deserve more light, take a second to like this video, subscribe for more hidden history, and share it with one person who loves powerful true stories. His name was William Johnson. He was a free black man in a country that still treated freedom like a favor. He shaved Abraham Lincoln. He dressed him. He handled the small daily details that helped a president face the world. He stood near Lincoln in ways most men never could. Close enough to hold a razor at his throat, close enough to see him sick, close enough to be trusted, and still somehow far enough from power that history almost let him disappear. That is the cruel heart of this story. William Johnson was close to one of the most famous men in American history, yet he was never allowed to stand fully inside the world he helped support. He was useful. He was trusted. He was needed. But he was not truly welcomed. Not by the White House staff. Not by the society around him. Not by the kind of record-keeping that preserved the lives of powerful people, while letting men like him slip into silence. When people talk about Abraham Lincoln, they talk about war, slavery, Gettysburg, the Emancipation Proclamation, the burdens of leadership, and the tragedy of assassination. They talk about the giant events. They talk about the speeches that still echo. But history is not only made by speeches and battles. It is also made by the people who wake before dawn, warm the water, prepare the clothes, carry the messages, calm the room, and stay beside someone when the danger becomes personal. William Johnson was one of those people, and the deeper you look into his life, the more painful the pattern becomes. Again and again he appears at the edge of major history. Again and again he proves his loyalty. Again and again the record turns away before it tells us enough about him. We do not have a photograph that can clearly give us his face. We do not have letters in his own voice. We do not have a rich stack of memories written by people eager to preserve him. Much of what survives comes through papers connected to Lincoln. A recommendation. A note, a check, a few official traces. It is like trying to rebuild a whole life from the shadows it cast on someone else's desk. And yet those shadows say a lot. To understand why William Johnson's story matters, we have to start before Washington, before the White House, before the war fully consumed Lincoln's life. We have to go back to Springfield, Illinois, in the tense months before Lincoln became president. Springfield was not some grand capital. It was a growing town with muddy streets, political gossip, and the feeling that something big might be coming. Lincoln was still known there as a lawyer and rising political figure, not yet as the man who would hold the country together during Civil War. His household still had the shape of ordinary life. It had routines. It had tasks. It had the invisible labor that keeps any home running. Somewhere inside that world, William Johnson entered the picture. He worked around the Lincoln household as a barber, a bootblack, and a man who handled practical duties that other people barely noticed. It was work that put him physically near white men with status, but never truly beside them as an equal. That was one of the deepest contradictions of the era. A black barber could be trusted with a white man's face, his throat, his morning appearance, even his dignity. But that same barber could still be denied respect, denied belonging, and denied the basic security that should have come with being human. That contradiction sat at the center of Johnson's life. Think about the intimacy of shaving a man in the 19th century. This was not a quick electric razor and a bathroom mirror. This was a blade, water, leather, stillness, skill. A mistake could scar, a slip could kill. Lincoln had to sit there and trust the man standing over him. Morning after morning, Johnson earned that trust with steady hands. That says something important, not just about Johnson's work, but about Lincoln's dependence on him. We often imagine history as if powerful men move through it alone, guided only by their own minds. But no president lives that way. Every public figure is surrounded by people who manage the details. And sometimes those details are not small at all. Sometimes trust in private reveals more than speeches in public. Still, Johnson's place remained fragile. He was free, but freedom for a black man in that time was unstable. The law might say one thing, society might say another. One bad turn, one powerful enemy, one hostile system, and whatever protection a free black man thought he had could shrink fast. Even in places that called themselves free, black life was fenced in by prejudice, restriction, and constant vulnerability. That is one reason this story hits so hard. Johnson was not just navigating service to a powerful man. He was navigating an entire nation that had already decided men who looked like him belonged lower, quieter, and farther away from power. Then Lincoln's life changed. In May of 1860, he was chosen as the Republican nominee for president. Suddenly, the Springfield house was no longer just a home. It became a stage. Visitors came. Political allies arrived. Reporters watched. Neighbors crowded in. Excitement filled the air. And in that chaotic moment, William Johnson briefly stood in a visible role. He was at the door. He announced names. He guided guests inside. For one evening, the man history usually left in the background became the first person many visitors encountered before meeting Lincoln himself. That small image matters. It shows how close Johnson was to the center of events, but it also shows how temporary visibility can be when the world is built to ignore you. He could stand at the doorway of history and still not be invited into its memory. After Lincoln won the election, the ordinary world of Springfield began to fall away. The family prepared to leave. Furniture was sold. Plans were made. A train journey east approached. And as Lincoln moved toward the presidency, Johnson moved with that orbit, at least in part, into the next chapter. That next chapter was Washington. Washington in early 1861 was anxious, suspicious, and unstable. The nation was cracking apart. Threats were real. Lincoln arrived as a president many people doubted, some despised, and others were willing to kill. The capital itself felt unfinished, almost like a place waiting to see whether it would remain the capital of a united country at all. Inside the White House, another conflict waited. Johnson was placed on the payroll soon after Lincoln took office. Officially, he held a household role, but titles do not tell the real story. The real story was how the White House staff reacted to him. Johnson was dark-skinned in a staff world where color hierarchy was already deeply felt. The other workers did not welcome him. They did not treat him like part of the same circle. The exclusion may not always have been written down in dramatic language, but it was there. And Lincoln noticed. That detail matters because it reveals two truths at the same time. First, Johnson faced discrimination not out in some distant street, but inside the president's own household. Second, Lincoln cared enough to try to help him. With the country racing toward civil war, Lincoln still took time to write on Johnson's behalf. He sought another job for him in government, trying to move him into a more stable position, away from the hostility in the mansion. That effort alone tells you Johnson was not just another servant to Lincoln. Presidents do not spend time writing recommendations for people they barely value. They do not personally intervene in work arrangements for someone they do not trust. Johnson mattered to Lincoln in a practical, human, and daily way. Eventually, Johnson received a Treasury Department job as a messenger.
On paper, that might look like a transfer.
In reality, it was more than that. It was Lincoln trying to solve a problem the White House could not or would not fix. It was a quiet act of support in a world where open declarations had limits. But what happened next is one of the strongest signs of Johnson's importance. Even after moving into that government role, he kept returning to the White House in the mornings. He continued to shave Lincoln. He continued to help him dress. He continued to do the personal work that made Lincoln ready for the day. And before we go further, if this story is pulling you in, hit like, join the channel, and pass this video along so more people hear the name's history nearly buried. That means Johnson did not simply work in Lincoln's world. He remained woven into Lincoln's routine, and routines reveal dependence. We tend to think the biggest moments define relationships. A famous speech, a dramatic rescue, a public embrace. But often the deepest trust is built in repetition. One morning, then another, then another. A man enters the room, sets things in order, prepares the water, lays out the clothes, uses a razor inches from the skin, says little, leaves, comes back the next day, and after enough days he is no longer just a worker. He becomes part of the structure that holds another man's life together. That seems to be what Johnson became for Lincoln. There are other signs of it in the surviving record. Lincoln wrote notes on his behalf. He seems to have supported Johnson's efforts to secure income. He helped with practical matters that touched Johnson's stability. One detail stands out especially. Johnson reportedly bought a house in Washington, and Lincoln personally helped back the mortgage. Think about what that means. The President of the United States was willing to place his own name and responsibility beside the financial future of a black servant in the middle of a deeply racist society. That was not ordinary. It did not mean the world around Johnson had changed. It did not mean prejudice vanished. It did not mean Lincoln was some flawless figure floating above the limitations of his time. But it did mean this relationship had moved beyond convenience. Lincoln was not just using Johnson's labor. He was investing trust in his life. And yet even then, the gap between private loyalty and public status never disappeared. Johnson had a wife. He had children. He was building a life in Washington under conditions that were still harsh, uncertain, and unequal. But the record barely pauses to tell us about them. Their names slide away. Their daily fears are mostly unwritten. Their memories were not treated as national property worth preserving. That is part of the tragedy, too. Not only do we lose Johnson's voice, we lose the voices of the family that survived him. By late 1863, the war had dragged the country through enormous bloodshed. Lincoln was carrying unbearable pressure. Casualty lists kept growing. Political attacks kept coming. The future of the Union was still not secure. Then came the trip to Gettysburg. Today, Gettysburg feels almost sacred in American memory because of the speech Lincoln gave there. But in that moment, it was simply another journey layered on top of war, illness, grief, and exhaustion. Lincoln traveled to dedicate the soldiers' cemetery after one of the war's bloodiest battles. Johnson went with him as part of the president's orbit, just as he had so many times before. What matters here is not only the speech, it is what happened around it. Lincoln was not well. Reports from the trip described him as tired, drained, and unsteady. At the time, observers did not fully grasp what that meant. Smallpox was already present in Washington. Disease moved through the city in a way that made every illness feel dangerous. Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address anyway. He stood before the crowd and gave the brief words that would one day become immortal. But on the ride back, his condition worsened. This is the turning point that defines William Johnson's story. During the return journey, Lincoln developed a fever and severe discomfort. For hours on the train, Johnson stayed beside him, cooling him with a wet cloth and tending him as his body weakened. That image is one of the clearest windows we have into Johnson's loyalty, not loyalty in the abstract, not loyalty as a slogan, loyalty in physical risk, loyalty in quiet service, loyalty when the room is uncomfortable, the air is tense, and the danger is no longer political but personal and contagious. No one can say with perfect certainty what Johnson understood in that moment. Maybe he knew the risk clearly. Maybe he only sensed it. But people in that era knew enough about smallpox to fear it. They knew enough to know that closeness to the sick was dangerous. Johnson stayed anyway. That choice says everything. He was not required by public glory. No crowd would cheer him. No newspaper would celebrate the man cooling the president's head with a damp cloth. There was only the work, the danger, and the decision to remain. After returning to Washington, Lincoln was diagnosed with a mild form of smallpox. He was confined. He suffered through the rash and fever. Government business had to bend around his illness. And through those days, Johnson remained among the people helping manage the physical realities of the president's condition. Then Lincoln recovered, and Johnson did not. In January 1864, Johnson fell seriously ill. The diagnosis was smallpox. Suddenly, the man who had been caring for Lincoln became the one lying in a hospital bed, too weak to continue the work that had tied him so closely to the White House. Here the story becomes almost unbearable because the roles reverse so sharply. For years, Johnson had been the one who stood near Lincoln, hands steady, doing what needed to be done. Now Lincoln could not stand beside Johnson in the same way. A president could not simply walk into a contagious ward and risk another infection in the middle of a war. The intimacy that had defined their relationship was broken by illness itself, so Lincoln did what he could from a distance. One of the most striking surviving scenes comes from this period. Lincoln was reportedly found at his desk counting Johnson's wages by hand, one bill at a time, placing the money carefully into an envelope for the sick man. Think about how personal that is. In the middle of civil war, with national crisis on every side, the President of the United States was taking time to make sure a dying black employee received his pay. That is not a grand public gesture. That is something quieter. In some ways, it is more revealing because it was not staged. It was the behavior of a man who felt responsibility towards someone who had served him faithfully. There is another haunting detail tied to this moment. Lincoln was asked whether he believed Johnson may have caught the disease from him. His answer was uncertain. He did not confidently reject the idea. He seems to have recognized that it was possible. Imagine living with that thought. Imagine surviving an illness, returning to work and knowing that a man who sat beside you, who cared for you, who chose not to leave your side, was now dying from the same disease. Whether Lincoln caused it or not could never be proved with certainty. But the possibility alone carries a terrible moral weight. It turns Johnson's loyalty into something even more tragic. The very act of devotion may have exposed him to death, and still Lincoln kept acting on Johnson's behalf. He helped settle financial burdens. He supported Johnson's family. He reportedly paid off what remained of his mortgage. He arranged practical help, because practical help was all he could still offer. That detail matters because it shows the limits of power. Lincoln was president, but even he could not simply reverse sickness. He could send money. He could ease debt. He could arrange burial. He could not walk back time. Johnson died on January 28, 1864. He was around 30 years old, maybe close to it. Even that basic fact is uncertain. Think about how brutal that is. A man can work in the White House, serve a president, tend him through sickness, die in the middle of war, and still have parts of his own identity left blurry in the record. His wife and children were left behind. Their loss is real, but history barely lets them speak. Their names are not held up beside the names of generals and politicians. Their grief was private. Their survival was uncertain. The man who had stood near the center of national power left this world as so many ordinary people do, with a family forced to absorb the pain while history moved on. Lincoln did not attend the funeral. He could not safely expose himself to that environment after his own illness, but he paid for the burial and related expenses himself. Again, this was not symbolic language, it was concrete action. He handled what he could handle. If this chapter of hidden history is hitting you hard, subscribe, share it with a friend, and let this video carry William Johnson's name farther than the record ever did. By itself, that would already be a tragic ending. But the story did not stop with Johnson's death. In some ways, the second tragedy began after he was gone. For a long time, people repeated a powerful story about his grave. They said William Johnson had been buried at Arlington under a stone marked with the word citizen. It sounded almost perfect. A black man who served Lincoln, a grave word that seemed to push back against a country that denied black people full belonging. It felt poetic. It felt like the kind of ending history should have given him. But when later historians looked harder, that clean ending started to fall apart. The evidence tying that grave to Johnson turned out to be weak. The famous word on the stone does not appear to have been a special tribute chosen just for him. It seems to have been a general label used for civilians in that section. The grave that many people pointed to with confidence may not have belonged to Lincoln's valet at all. That matters because it means the story most people wanted to believe may have hidden a sadder truth. William Johnson may have been misplaced not only in life but in death. The country may have built a moving legend around him while losing track of where he was actually buried. And that changes everything. Because now his story is not only about loyalty, it is also about erasure. It is about how easily a man can be essential in one moment and nearly untraceable in the next. It is about how history often preserves the powerful in exact detail, while leaving everyone around them blurred at the edges. We know Lincoln's words. We know his face. We know what desk he used, what speeches he gave, what burdens he carried. But for Johnson, so much is missing. No confirmed portrait. No rich stack of letters in his own voice. No clear record that settles every detail of his family, his age, his burial, or even the full shape of his earlier life. That absence is not just frustrating. It is meaningful. It tells us something about the country Johnson lived in. A country ready to rely on black labor, black skill, and black loyalty. but far less ready to preserve black humanity with the same care. Johnson could help prepare a president for the day. He could nurse him through fever. He could risk his own safety staying close. And still the nation could fail to keep a complete record of the man himself. That is why this story reaches beyond one household or one president. It shows how memory works. It shows who gets centered and who gets pushed to the side. It shows how easy it is for the lives behind famous lives to disappear unless someone goes back and insists on seeing them clearly. It also forces us to be honest about Lincoln. This is not a simple story where one man is purely noble and the other purely victimized. Lincoln seems to have truly trusted Johnson. He helped him find work. He backed him financially. He counted out his wages by hand when he was too sick to collect them. He helped support Johnson's family after illness hit. Those are not empty gestures. They point to real care. But at the same time, Johnson still lived inside a racist system that did not bend just because the president valued him. The White House staff could still treat him as unwanted. Society could still mark him as lesser. His closeness to Lincoln did not free him from the rules of the world around him. That tension is what makes the story feel so real. A bond can be genuine and unequal at the same time. A man can be trusted deeply in private and still denied dignity in public. Someone can matter every day to a powerful figure and still remain vulnerable, replaceable in the eyes of the larger system, and almost invisible in the historical record. William Johnson lived inside that contradiction. He was close enough to power to witness history from just a few feet away. He was not protected enough to escape the danger that came with that closeness. He may even have paid for his loyalty with his life. And that is what makes the image of Lincoln counting his wages so haunting. It is such a small act, yet it carries enormous weight. No audience, no speech, no applause. Just a president handling the money of a dying man with unusual care. In that one scene, you can almost feel the whole relationship. Trust, responsibility, gratitude, helplessness, maybe even guilt. A careful envelope becomes the last physical sign of a connection built through years of quiet service. And maybe that is why the moment lasts. Because it feels human in a story where so much else was swallowed by war, rank, and official memory. The biggest events of the era were roaring in the background, but here, for a moment, history shrinks to something personal. One man trying to do one last practical kindness for another man he could not save. That does not erase the injustice around them. If anything, it makes the injustice sharper, because care existed and still it was not enough. Respect existed and still it was not enough. Loyalty existed and still it was not enough. Johnson died young anyway. His family grieved anyway. The record thinned around him anyway, even now. Generations later, people still have to fight to piece together the outline of his life from scattered mentions and surviving scraps. So what do we do with a story like this? We stop treating it like a footnote. We stop acting as if only the man at the podium matters. We stop pretending the people behind the curtain are just background. We start asking harder questions. Who prepared the famous man for the room? Who stood beside him when he was weak? Who carried the quiet risks that never made it into the speech? In Lincoln's case, one of those people was William Johnson, a free black man in an unfree age, a worker trusted with intimate duties few others could perform. Man pushed away by prejudice and pulled close by necessity, a caretaker whose loyalty was proven not in grand declarations, but in daily action. A father and husband whose family deserved more than a fading trace in somebody else's archive. And maybe most of all, a reminder that history is full of people who held the story together while receiving almost none of its glory. That is why his fate feels tragic in more than one sense. It was tragic because he died young. It was tragic because he may have caught a deadly disease while caring for the president he served. It was tragic because even deep trust could not shield him from the inequalities of his time. And it was tragic because after his death, memory itself proved unreliable. But there is another side to that tragedy. The fact that his story was nearly erased is exactly why telling it matters now. Every time a forgotten life is recovered with honesty, the old imbalance weakens a little. Every time we refuse the easy legend and choose the harder truth, we give the past back some of its missing depth. And every time we say William Johnson's name with care, we push against the silence that almost swallowed him. So remember him not as a side character in somebody else's greatness, but as a man whose own life reveals something essential about America. Remember the razor in his steady hands. Remember the train ride from Gettysburg. Remember the wet cloth on a fevered forehead. Remember the hospital bed. Remember the envelope on Lincoln's desk. Remember the possibility that even his grave was lost inside a system that never valued men like him enough. And remember what that means. It means history is never complete just because the famous names are in place. It means some of the most important people are the ones standing just outside the frame. It means loyalty can be real, sacrifice can be invisible, and truth can take generations to recover. William Johnson's story is painful because it forces us to see all of that at once. A man trusted enough to stand at a president's throat with a blade, man loyal enough to stay near him in sickness, a man vulnerable enough to die when that sickness turned toward him, a man forgotten enough that the nation still struggles to tell his ending with certainty. That is the tragic fate of Lincoln's most loyal black, Valet, and that is exactly why he should never be forgotten again.